we are entering into the season of Lent. So this is going to be a little bit of a different sermon. It's actually going to be more almost like heartfelt sharing. The last sermon series we did was the Hebrew Scriptures in a Postmodern World, which was, we hope, impactful, but kind of heady and theological too, to help us understand how we read the Old Testament as Christians. This sermon series is going to be a little bit more hearty. I don't think that's even a word, I'm making it up, but heartfelt probably is what I'm trying to say. And so throughout the whole sermon series, we're going to be walking through really what we call an inward journey. So, Lent, I grew up in a tradition, charismatic, conservative, evangelical tradition, and I never really remember anything about Lent. It might have been touched on here and there. Do you remember anything? No. It might have been touched on. The only thing I can recall is I knew a few people who were Catholics, and I knew that for whatever reason they gave up chocolate during Lent. So as a kid and a young adult, that's not all that enticing, right? It's kind of like the priesthood, like celibacy, not all that enticing. Like Lent sounds awesome. Give up candy and chocolate. Right on. So how many of you guys grew up in a tradition that celebrated Lent? Is there, okay. So we do have a few people that celebrated Lent. That's awesome. So today we begin our series, A Deeper Journey, and we're going to talk about three things today. We're going to talk a little bit about Lent, talk about our sermon series, and then do a little bit of an invitation. So that's where we are headed today. Lent, the next slide will show. I showed this slide during Advent. So we've kind of hit on a couple seasons. This is the Christian calendar. Some people call it the Christian year, the liturgical calendar, different words. Basically, Christians over the years have kind of created a different way of telling the seasons or telling time. And a lot of the point of this calendar following is to highlight different aspects. That there's times and seasons in our life to reflect, for example, Advent, anticipating Christmas. Christmas, celebrating, of course, the birth and what God is doing. Epiphany means the revelation of who Jesus is. Then we go into Lent, which is basically a time, as Jacob prayed, of self-examination, of fasting, prayer. It leads us all the way into Holy Week and into Easter. Holy Week, if you're not familiar, is just the week leading up to Easter, primarily Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, and then some people call it Holy Saturday, and then leads us into Easter. The next slide here gives a little bit of an idea about Lent. Lent is basically the 40 days leading up to Easter, minus the Sundays. So if you're a mathematician over there, Janet, and you're trying to count in your head, you'll notice it's like 44, 45 days because it's excluding the Sundays. But it primarily emphasizes prayer, fasting, self-examination. Let me say, I think most of us, if not all of us, would agree the Christian life is primarily about love. That's kind of the aim or the goal. And so sometimes when we talk about self-examination, it can kind of almost seem selfish, like, wow, we're kind of navel-gazing. Why are we talking about ourselves so much? And part of the reason is because to really love other people, we have to dive in to examine ourselves, even sometimes the shadows or the weaknesses, and to extend love and compassion to ourselves. And to be honest, if we don't love ourselves very much, then we don't really love other people. And the more we can accept and love ourselves in the midst of our insecurities and shadows, the more we can extend that love to others. So, the inner journey. Most of our life is lived on what I would call the exterior, the physical. And if you're like any normal human being living in America, you have so many things pulling and grabbing your attention. Do this, do that, go pick up this. If you have little kids, they're pulling on your arms, tugging you, mommy, daddy, whatever, come do this. You're constantly being pulled and tossed into so many different directions on the exterior that few people pay any attention or have any idea the interior or what it means to do an inner journey. New Testament, or New York Times, not the same thing. New Testament, New York Times, let's separate those. New York Times columnist and best-selling author David Brooks wrote a book called The Road to Character. And you can follow on your screen. It says, or he wrote, "We live in a society that encourages us to think about how to have great careers, or a great career, but leaves many of us inarticulate about how to cultivate the inner life. The competition to succeed and win admiration is so fierce that it becomes all-consuming. We live in a culture that teaches us to promote and advertise ourselves to master the skills required for success, but that gives little encouragement to humility, sympathy, honesty, self-confrontation, which are necessary for building character. Years pass and the deepest part of yourself goes unexplored and unstructured. You are busy, but you have a vague anxiety that your life has not achieved its ultimate meaning and significance. So we're doing a season of self-examination, of an inner journey, of asking, who am I? What's going on in my interiors? What does this mean? Because the last thing I want to do is get to the end of my life and feel like I missed it somehow, like something just didn't connect. And that could be true even accomplishing great things or being extremely successful. People have gotten to their end of their life and somehow felt a little empty inside. Cultivating the inner life. What does that mean? Most times, if you said that to most Americans, we'd be like, I'm not really sure how do I cultivate the inner life? Well, first of all, the word cultivate implies that there's something we do. You cultivate. Somehow you stir up. You do something. It's a journey you take, so you're participating in that. And as I talked before, the next slide will show, I think there's almost two separate, but you cannot separate them completely, two different ways of understanding your life. There's the outer, the physical life, which is where most of us live, 99.99% of the life, if not 100%. And then there's the inner, the spiritual life. And I don't think you can, this is almost a duality, and you can't separate that. So in some spiritual teachers will say you can't, there's non-dual thinking, which means it's not an either or. It's a both and, which means your physical life does influence your spiritual life. They're connected in some way. But most of us, most people in America especially, will live without being aware of anything in their inner life. I see a bunch of nods, so at least I feel like you're at least including me and feeling like I'm making sense here, which is good. Thank you guys for that. One aspect is this idea that we're asleep to our inner life. We're not aware of our inner life. Jesus was a first century Jewish rabbi who often taught in parables. And parables are these short, sometimes obscure stories that are meant to prove a point, or probably better to illuminate a truth in a different way. Jesus didn't go around teaching people what to believe as much as showing people how to see. And so we read in the Gospel of Matthew where his first followers ask, why are you teaching in parables all the time? I don't understand. Why are you teaching us in this way? And this is Jesus' response, and you can read on the slide. And Jesus says, the reason I speak to them in parables is that seeing they do not perceive and hearing they do not listen, nor do they understand. With them indeed is fulfilled the prophet Isaiah. And he quotes the prophet Isaiah. You will indeed listen, but never understand. You will indeed look, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and their ears are hard of hearing. They have shut their eyes so that they might not look with their eyes and listen with their ears and understand with their heart and turn, and I would heal them. Blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. So that can be kind of an obscure passage, right? I mean, Jesus is saying, I'm teaching in parables because some people will see, but a lot of people aren't going to see. Some people will hear, but a lot of people aren't going to hear. And it's almost like he's saying, I'm teaching in stories and parables because it will make sense and resonate to the people it needs to make sense and resonate to and with. And it's a way to invite people to begin to see. Jesus taught a lot about seeing and hearing, and the fact that sometimes we see and we don't see, and it can be a little bit confusing. Richard Rohr, to help us understand, he taught in a homily, which is like a Catholic sermon, like a mini sermon, like 10-minute mini sermon, and he says this, so you can read on the screen. He says, seeing is not recognizing. The movement of faith is not just seeing things, but recognizing them in their deepest meaning, which is to recognize they are inherently connected to both God and you. So we see, but we don't really see. Or as Jesus said, you see, but you don't perceive. Or as Richard Rohr says, you see, but you don't recognize. It's almost like there's a physical life, and then there's something beyond that sometimes it's hard to really see. You can live in the physical, the exterior, and not be able to see, not be able to perceive, and then you can experience something else, and all of a sudden it's like your eyes are open, and now you begin to see. So what does this mean in actual life? How does this look like for us? I am willing to bet that every one of us have had a moment, probably multiple moments in our life, where we experienced something everyday, ordinary, and then something switched and we were made aware that there's perhaps more going on here than meets the physical eye, that this is a sacred moment. Perhaps it's just eating dinner with friends, and all of a sudden you just sit back and something clicks, and you're just involved with everything, and all of a sudden you sit back and you're like, man, this is a sacred time. Just eating a meal, there's something beautiful about this here. You were once seeing, but now you became aware. Or perhaps you were at a park. The other day we were at a park down the street, and it was beautiful weather, and we have two boys, 7 and 5, and they were playing, and it was normal, just normal life, just doing what you're doing, and all of a sudden just began to think, oh my gosh, this is beautiful. And also the fact that something within me is like, this is also fleeting. Like, my kids are not going to always want to play in a park, and in 10 years they might look at me and be like, no, Dad, we don't want to play in a park. I want whatever technology is going to be around in 10 years. Who knows, right? But it's the simple little things in ordinary life. And I think Jesus taught about this a lot. Seeing you don't perceive is really an idea that perhaps there's more going on in everyday life. How aware are we most of the time? I would say most of us, including myself, I'm aware very small amount of the time of the sacredness, the beauty, the connection of all things. Spirituality, I think, has a lot to do with seeing, becoming aware, opening those spiritual eyes, so to speak, and seeing the sacred moments that we share with each other and with everyone else around us. I'm going to talk a little bit about spiritual formation for a moment. It's a phrase that is, again, not often used, but is something that's really close to my heart, something I'm really passionate about. Spiritual formation asks the questions, if the goal of the Christian life is love, or the goal of the spiritual life is to love or recognize, become aware, then how are we formed in that way? How do we grow that? How do you cultivate that inner life, right? That's spiritual formation. How are we formed as spiritual beings? Often people who teach on spiritual formation or this idea will say, well, really it's God who does the work. Somehow we become aware, and it's almost like the divine meets us where we are, and God brings us forward. But there's also this idea that we have a role to play in part of that. We can grow and cultivate this. And so next slide here it's from a website, Renovare website. It's a group, Richard Foster outside of Denver, Colorado. He runs this kind of organization called Renovare. Am I saying it right? Renovare? I think so. Maybe not. I always look at my wife. Am I doing everything right? Moving on. We'll read the next slide. This is taken off their website. Not that she controls me or says stuff afterwards. I think I'm digging myself in a hole here. Reading on. We are all spiritual beings. Think about that for a moment. This is the underlying premise of spiritual formation. We are spiritual beings. We have physical bodies, but our lives are largely driven by an unseen part of us. There's an immaterial center in us that shapes the way we see the world and ourselves. It directs the choices we make, guides our actions. Our spirit is the most important part of who we are. And yet we rarely spend time developing our inner life. The most important part of who we are, and yet we rarely spend time developing this. That's what spiritual formation is all about. Spiritual formation is a process, but is also a journey through which we open our hearts to a deeper connection with God, with the divine, with the sacred. We are not bystanders in our spiritual lives, but we are active participants with God who is ever inviting us into relationship with him. We're active participants in this formational process. One pastor, A.J. Sherrill, wrote, "Whereas God is the transforming agent, formation does in fact require human effort." And so I agree with most of that. And here's why. I think you and I, we are formed unconsciously by pretty much every decision we make in our lives. Everything we do forms us. Are we aware of it or not? Every decision has some implication in how it forms us. I kind of see it as we create the habits of our life, we create the rhythms, what we do, when we do it, how we do it, and then those rhythms begin to form us as human beings. Do they form us in ways where we're growing into love and forgiveness and generosity, or do they form us in ways where we find ourselves becoming more and more selfish because we haven't consciously chosen to serve others or to give of our time? Because that begins to form us as well. But I still believe that we can be conscious, we can be intentional about forming our spiritual lives. And I think all religions that I know of have some implication of that. Like you can be intentional about who you are and who you are becoming and somehow partner with God in that process. Is this making sense? Mostly? Thank you for the yes. All of that to say, where are we going in this sermon series? The next slide will say there's two parts, two visions, two things we're thinking about in this Lenten season for this series. One, encourage each of us together to create space for God to work in our lives by forgoing things or fasting something. And two, take a journey inward by creating spiritual disciplines in our life. So let's talk about fasting. It's a pretty popular topic. Not so much in progressive circles, per se. But by the way, the first Christians fasted, many believe, twice a week. That's taken from the Jewish people who also fasted twice a week. And so Christians adopted, I think they kind of changed the days. I think the Jewish people fasted like Tuesday, Thursday, and they said, oh, we need to do something a little bit different that separates us. I think it was like Friday or Wednesday, Friday, where they fasted food from sunrise to sunset. But fasting is a part of our tradition. Fasting during Lent is a part of the Christian tradition, although it's more so among Catholics and Orthodox Christians. Fasting, next slide you can read, is basically, it just means intentionally abstaining from something. And we'll read together. There's a website that I thought captured the idea behind fasting, which is fasting reconnects the body to the emotions, to our mind, and to our soul, by interrupting our autopilot mode and recognizing the ways we self-medicate that might be destructive to our souls. Fasting, abstaining from something. Now, traditionally, many Christians fasted food, like from sunrise to sunset, but nowadays, there's so many other things in our life that we can fast from, abstain from. And the reason is that it connects us to the rest of who we are, and it helps us. We run on autopilot. I run on autopilot. How many times do I drive home and be like, I don't remember how I got here. I just showed up, right? I'm just like, okay, I got here safe. My kids are alive. Great, right? Or sometimes I make a wrong turn and I'm like, where am I going? Like, I was just living somewhere else. Maybe I shouldn't be allowed to drive. Anyways, but we live on autopilot. And how many ways do we self-medicate? Maybe it's not always wrong. I don't think it's necessarily wrong at times to kind of numb out a little bit, to flip on the Netflix, to lay back, to have a beer, whatever it is. But how many times does that then become a pattern in our life? And all of a sudden, maybe you've seen it in your own life. I've totally seen it in my life so many times, but I've seen it in other people's where that pattern all of a sudden drags you down deeper and deeper. And so fasting is this idea that I'm going to abstain from something to maybe help me become more aware of these patterns. So perhaps fasting food is something. Perhaps fasting a certain kind of food is another thing. And again, connecting the physical to the spiritual, I think some people kind of take Lent and say, I'm going to implement the spiritual in a healthy physical, and I'm going to fast something that I don't like beer and pizza, right here, right? So I'm implementing both the spiritual and the health aspects of that. And that way it goes to when I really crave a beer or a piece of pizza, then I create space and an awareness. And fasting says, oh, I'm craving this. And then I turn to something else, hopefully something that's more edifying for my soul, for my spirit. Does that make sense? So maybe it's attitudes. And this one's kind of tricky because it's like, well, I want to fast from this negative attitude, which might be almost impossible. But at least through Lent, maybe you can notice things and attitudes in your own life and patterns and say, wow, I've been given into this pattern in my life. I want to become more aware of that. Or perhaps it's TV or Netflix. And you're like, every night I go home and I watch an hour and a half of Netflix. What would it mean if I gave that up for 40 days? How would that shape my life? Or perhaps social media, ouch, Facebook. Or even just limiting yourself. Because how many, we have smartphones that we carry around and we just check all the time. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat. Now that there's more and more and more things for us to check, maybe it's, okay, I'm going to set this. It's not wrong, by the way. I don't think any of those things are wrong, but they can form us, I believe, as people, as humans. So I'm going to set this and I'm going to check it 3 times a day for 10 minutes, once in the morning, once at noon-ish, and once at night. I'm going to fast that way to create more time, more space in my life. There's a ton of other ways you can fast, and I'll let you use your imagination on that. So let's talk about spiritual disciplines. I love Henry Nouwen, who's an author and a Catholic priest. He defines spiritual practices as the effort to create some space in where God can act. The effort to create space in which God can act. Really, that's what spiritual practices does, and fasting is a spiritual practice too. How do we allow some space? And if you're like me, it's hard. Not only is it hard, but then your mind is like the hamster wheel, and everything is so busy, so you're like, oh, I'm going to spend 10 minutes in silence, and you sit there and you're like, oh my gosh, I got to do this, got to do that, got to do this, got to do that, da-da-da-da-da. And then afterwards you're done, and you're like, man, that was not helpful at all, right? You're like, it's easy to kind of be frustrated in the beginning, and just recognize that. And what I found true, and I'm not good at this, I'm not an expert, and I'm not even that good at this, but creating space. And the more we create space in our lives, the easier that time becomes. And primarily, we create space and engage in spiritual disciplines, not because we're looking for some sort of miraculous encounter, although that could happen. But I think what we're looking for is, how does that time allow us to become more awake the rest of our lives, where maybe we're less reactive. Maybe we're more aware of God or other people's needs during those times. So some spiritual practices, just easy ones, of course, is prayer, reading scripture. Those are easy ones. A devotional. I've invited everybody to go through a Lenten devotional by Richard Rohr, who's a Franciscan friar, one of my favorite people in the entire world. This one's called Wondrous Encounters. We sold 8 of them last week, and I think we have like 3 more in the back. They're $10 a piece. We're not trying to make money here, so it's not a scam or anything. You can buy them on Amazon too, if you prefer, but this is just every day. It's a short reading, a meditation. It takes like 2 or 3 minutes. It's not long at all. But I wanted to invite you to do that along with us. And it's kind of helpful to do that as a community. You have support. You have other people going around. Today, on Sunday, his scripture reading was on temptation and Jesus in the wilderness. By the way, the Lenten 40 days is taken from Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness, where he fasted and where he encountered temptation. And Richard Rohr talks about temptation in today's meditation. He says, we're never tempted by what we don't want or what is completely evil. It's always partially good. There's always something there it's partially good, and it tempts us to move in that direction. Anyways, that's free of charge. That was just a little bit from today. So at this time, I'm going to invite the worship team to come back up. And we're doing this flow a little bit different. So the next slide is an invitation for us to sit back during the first part of this next song and to meditate on these 3 questions. Is there something you feel invited to fast, to abstain from Lent? Don't feel like you have to. By the way, fasting doesn't make you a more spiritual person. In fact, Jesus called that out. And the prophets called it out. But perhaps there is something you could say, I want to abstain from this, give a little bit of space from this in my life. Is there a spiritual practice or practices that you feel invited to engage in? Perhaps something a little bit different than you've done before or than you've been doing before. Part of this is you fast, you create space, and then you take something else and you fill that space. That's your practice. It could be as simple as a nature walk, something you're already doing. If you're hiking and you're like, oh, I'm hiking with friends, where's my destination? When we get there, I'm going to take 5 minutes just to myself. It's simple things. You can integrate it into whatever it is you're doing in your life. What is a spiritual practice or something you might feel invited to engage in? And then lastly, if you choose to enter into this season intentionally, what is that intention? Often in spiritual practices, including yoga, they'll begin with a sort of intention or a call to intention. Why are you doing this? So maybe it's a time to examine, why would I be doing this? Just to give you an example, to be vulnerable here, I entered into this Lent season with the intention of sensing God's presence more, of all that talk about awareness and being more aware in my daily life. It's birthed out of my intention, really, during this Lent season. Of like, I had realized that, oh gosh, I have been so busy with so much stuff. Most of it's really good stuff, but it's all distracting. And so that was my intention, becoming more aware, sensing God's presence more often. And as I began Lent season, I added another intention. And that was at the very beginning. Let's see if I can find it here. Richard Rohr. This isn't mine, so I don't have this one highlighted. Oh, there it is. He says, new beginnings invariably come from old false things that are allowed to die. And I think somebody else posted this on Facebook this week too. New beginnings invariably come from old false things that are allowed to die. And so I furthered my intention in realizing that I struggle a ton with shame and self-doubt. And saying maybe these are things, in fact, Richard Rohr and others would talk about spirituality less as obtaining things, like I'm more this, and more as letting go of the bad patterns and habits. Spirituality is more about less and releasing those things than it is I'm more righteous. Instead, it's I'm slowly less judgmental. So shame was something specifically that I went in with a specific intention for. And I struggle with that. Every Sunday, most Sundays I get up here and I speak and I'm like, who am I? I'm young. I'm not that experienced. I'm not that smart. Just ask my wife, right? Who am I? Why would I do this? Who's going to listen to me? And it's almost like every Sunday it's a step in courage. Like, okay, I'll step out and do that. But maybe your intention is to gain something, and maybe your intention is to release something.